The mud tasted like copper and defeat. Corporal Nerathen's blood mixed with Cordus II's poisoned soil as orbital fire painted the sky in shades of ending. Her squad had left her, another casualty number, another alien body for the trenches. Above the siege, engines screamed through smoke, but death had already claimed her frequency. Then something impossible happened. A human ship descended into forbidden airspace, its pilot choosing mercy over orders. In that moment, Lieutenant, James Solin shattered every rule of war for a life that wasn't supposed to matter. The moral axis of centuries tilted on the edge of one man's defiance. Subscribe to witness how one act of compassion can rewrite the laws of war. The biomine explosion had torn through Naira's left shoulder like a hungry beast, shredding muscle and bone with surgical precision. She lay face down in the trench, her purple blood seeping into the mud of Cordus II, mixing with the metallic taste of defeat that coated her tongue. The orbital bombardment continued overhead, each impact sending tremors through the ground that vibrated against her broken ribs. Her squad had moved on without her, standard protocol for the wounded who couldn't keep pace. In the calculus of war, she had become a liability, a number to be subtracted from the roster rather than a name to be remembered. The rain began to fall, each droplet carrying the chemical residue of the upper atmosphere battles, turning the mud around her into a toxic soup that burned against her exposed wounds. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, each inhalation a struggle against the weight of her own body pressing into the earth. The communication device in her helmet crackled with static, fragments of orders and casualty reports bleeding through the interference. She tried to lift her head, to signal her position, but her strength had abandoned her along with her comrades. The storm canyons of Cordus II echoed with the distant sounds of retreat, boots splashing through puddles, equipment clanking against armor, voices growing fainter with each passing moment. Naira closed her eyes and felt the planet claiming her, pulling her down into its hungry soil. She had always imagined death would come with more ceremony, more recognition of the life being extinguished. Instead, it arrived with the mundane persistence of rain and the gradual cooling of blood. The siege had lasted 14 months, turning the once verdant planet into a scarred wasteland of craters and chemical burns. Neera had seen entire cities reduced to rubble, their populations scattered like seeds on poisoned ground. She had watched friends die in explosions that left nothing but shadows burned into walls, their final moments preserved in atomic silhouettes. The war between her people and the humans had consumed 3 star systems, each battle more brutal than the last, each victory Pyrrhic in its cost. Now she lay dying in a trench that had no name, on a world that would soon be forgotten, her sacrifice meaningless in the vast machinery of interstellar conflict. The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had fought so hard to preserve life was now becoming part of the very soil that would nurture whatever grew from this devastation. Above her, the sky burned with the light of orbital weapons, their energy beams cutting through the atmosphere like the fingers of angry gods. The blockade had been in place for months, preventing any ship from entering or leaving the planet's airspace without authorization. Both sides had agreed to this containment, turning Cordus II into a closed arena where their hatred could play out without contaminating other worlds. Naira had always wondered what it would be like to see the stars again, to breathe air that didn't taste of smoke and death. Now she realized she would die without ever knowing if the war had meaning, if her people's cause was just, if the humans they fought were truly the monsters they had been taught to believe. The questions that had haunted her quiet moments would remain unanswered, buried with her in this nameless grave. Her vision began to blur, the edges of her sight growing dark as her body surrendered to its injuries. She thought of her mother, who had died in the first wave of attacks on their homeworld, and her brother, who had vanished during the siege of Altair Station. They had all believed they were fighting for something greater than themselves, for the preservation of their species and their way of life. But lying here in the mud, feeling her life drain away drop by drop, Naira wondered if they had all been deceived. Perhaps there was no greater purpose, no noble cause worth the mountains of corpses they had built in its name. Perhaps war was simply the universe's way of grinding civilizations into dust, regardless of their righteousness or their dreams. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last traces of her hope along with her blood. The sound of engines cut through the storm, distant at first but growing closer with each passing second. Naira forced her eyes open, expecting to see another bombing run or perhaps a reconnaissance drone mapping the battlefield for tomorrow's assault. Instead, she glimpsed something that defied every rule of engagement she had ever learned. A human ship, its hull scarred by battle, descending through the forbidden airspace above the siege lines. The pilot was either insane or suicidal, violating the blockade protocols that both sides had sworn to uphold. As consciousness began to slip away from her like water through cupped hands, Naira felt a strange emotion stirring in her chest. Not hope, for hope required faith in tomorrow, but something more immediate and desperate, the possibility that she might not die alone after all. Lieutenant James Solin gripped the controls of his medical transport as it bucked against the atmospheric turbulence, every fiber of his being focused on the impossible descent he had chosen to make. The communication array screamed with incoming messages from command, orders to abort, threats of court-martial, desperate pleas to return to authorized airspace. He switched off the radio with a decisive flick, cutting himself off from the chain of command that had defined his military career for the past 15 years. Below him, the battlefield of Cordus II spread out like a wound in the planet's flesh, its trenches and craters forming a grotesque map of human and alien suffering. His medical scanner had detected a faint life sign in the mud, a heartbeat growing weaker with each passing moment, and something deep in his core had refused to let him fly away. The orbital defense systems locked onto his ship, their targeting computers calculating firing solutions, but the human fleet held their fire, perhaps out of confusion, perhaps out of respect for his service record, or perhaps because someone in command understood that some acts transcended the boundaries of war. The ship's hull groaned under the stress of rapid descent, its heat shields glowing cherry red as they cut through the dense, chemical-laden atmosphere. James had made this run dozens of times before, extracting wounded human soldiers from impossible situations, but never had he crossed into enemy territory for an alien life. His hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, adjusting thrust vectors and compensating for the crosswinds that howled through the storm canyons. The biomines scattered across the landscape posed a constant threat, their sensors designed to detonate when they detected the electromagnetic signature of approaching aircraft. He flew low and fast, using the terrain to mask his approach, his ship's stealth systems working overtime to minimize their detection profile. Each second of flight brought him closer to the point of no return, the moment when his defiance would transform from insubordination into something approaching treason. The life sign on his scanner pulsed weakly, a tiny beacon of existence in an ocean of death. James had seen enough battlefields to recognize the signature of someone dying alone, their vital signs fading like a candle in the wind. He thought of his own son, lost in the early days of the war when an alien raid had destroyed the civilian transport carrying him to safety. The boy had been only 12, his life snuffed out before it had truly begun, another casualty in the endless cycle of retribution that had consumed both species. Perhaps that was why James couldn't abandon the dying alien below, because somewhere in the universe another father might be waiting for news of a child who would never come home. The mathematics of war demanded that enemies remain faceless, that compassion be reserved for one's own kind, but James had long ago stopped believing in the arithmetic of hatred. Every life had weight, every death diminished the universe, regardless of the species or uniform of the one who fell. His ship's proximity alarms began to wail as he approached the surface, the ground rushing up to meet him with terrifying speed. The landing zone was a crater-pocked stretch of mud between two trench lines, barely large enough to accommodate his transport and certainly not stable enough for a conventional landing. James engaged the vertical thrusters, fighting against gravity and wind to bring his ship down in a controlled hover just meters above the ground. The downdraft from his engines turned the mud below into a churning maelstrom, sending debris flying in all directions. Through the chaos, he could see the alien soldier, a female, he realized, her purple blood stark against the brown earth, her body motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was dying. That much was clear, but she was still alive, still fighting against the darkness that sought to claim her. That spark of defiance, that refusal to surrender even in the face of certain death, reminded him of every soldier he had ever served with, human or otherwise. The ship touched down with a bone-jarring impact, its landing struts sinking deep into the soft earth. James was already moving before the engines had fully spooled down, grabbing his medical kit and emergency stretcher from the cargo bay. The air outside was thick with smoke and chemical residue, burning his lungs with each breath, but he pressed forward through the mud toward the fallen alien. She was smaller than he had expected, her armor cracked and bloodied, her face pale beneath the grime of battle. Her eyes were closed, but he could see the slight movement of her lips as she whispered something in her native language. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a final message to loved ones she would never see again. James knelt beside her in the mud, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he assessed her injuries. The biomine had done terrible damage, but she was still alive, still fighting, and that was enough. He had crossed the boundaries of war to reach her, and he would not let her die alone in this God-forsaken place. As he worked to stabilize her wounds, James felt the weight of his decision settling around him like a shroud. He had thrown away his career, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom, for the life of an enemy soldier whose name he didn't even know. Command would never forgive this breach of protocol, this violation of everything they had been taught about the nature of their conflict. But as he lifted the alien woman onto his stretcher, feeling the fragile pulse of her heart against his hands, James knew he had made the only choice his conscience would allow. The war would continue, the hatred would endure, but tonight one life would be saved, one death prevented, one small act of mercy performed in defiance of the machinery of destruction that had consumed both their species. The moral axis of the war had shifted, if only by a degree, and perhaps that was enough to justify the price he would pay for his compassion. The medical bay of James's transport hummed with the quiet efficiency of life support systems as Naira drifted in and out of consciousness, her body suspended between death and recovery. The alien woman's breathing had stabilized during the flight to the human field hospital, but her injuries remained severe, requiring immediate surgical intervention that James was not qualified to provide. He had radioed ahead to the medical facility, requesting emergency clearance for an alien casualty, and the response had been a mixture of confusion, outrage, and grudging professional obligation. The Hippocratic Oath, it seemed, transcended species boundaries, even in the midst of interstellar war. As they approached the landing pad, James could see the medical team waiting with their equipment, their faces hidden behind surgical masks, but their body language betraying their uncertainty about treating an enemy combatant. The transport touched down with practiced precision, and within moments Naira was being transferred to a human stretcher, her purple blood stark against the white medical linens. Dr. Sarah Chen, the chief surgeon at the field hospital, had seen enough war to know that healing sometimes required setting aside the politics of conflict. She worked over Naira's unconscious form with the same dedication she would show any human patient, her hands moving with surgical precision as she repaired the damage caused by the biomine explosion. The alien physiology was different, but not incomprehensibly so. The basic principles of trauma surgery applied regardless of species, and Chen had studied enough xenobiology to understand the critical systems that needed immediate attention. Around her, the surgical team worked in focused silence, their professional training overriding any personal feelings they might have about their patient's origins. The operating theatre became a sanctuary where the rules of war held no sway, where the only imperative was the preservation of life. Hours passed as they labored to save a woman who, by all rights, should have been their enemy. James waited in the corridor outside the surgical suite, his uniform still stained with mud and alien blood, his mind replaying the events that had led him to this moment. Other medical personnel passed by, some offering nods of understanding, others averting their eyes in disapproval. Word of his unauthorized rescue mission had spread quickly through the facility, and he could feel the weight of judgment settling around him like a heavy cloak. His commanding officer had already transmitted orders for his immediate arrest upon completion of the medical emergency, but the hospital staff had invoked their authority to delay his detention until Nira's condition stabilized. It was a small mercy, but one that allowed him to see his mission through to its conclusion. He thought about the moment he had first seen her lying in the mud, dying alone and forgotten, and knew that he would make the same choice again, regardless of the consequences. The surgery stretched through the night, each hour marked by the steady rhythm of life support machines and the quiet conversations of medical staff. Nira's body fought against the trauma with remarkable resilience, her alien physiology adapting to the human medical procedures with surprising compatibility. Dr. Chen emerged from the operating theatre just as dawn was breaking over the battlefield, her surgical scrubs stained with purple blood, her face showing the exhaustion of a night spent wrestling death for a single life. She found James still waiting in the corridor, his eyes red with fatigue but alert with concern for his patient. "She'll live," Chen said simply, the words carrying the weight of professional certainty. "The damage was extensive, but we were able to repair the major vessels and stabilize her vital organs. She's strong, stronger than many humans I've treated with similar injuries." The relief that washed over James was so profound that he had to lean against the wall for support, the tension of the past 12 hours finally releasing its grip on his body. As Nira began her slow journey back to consciousness, she found herself in a place that defied every expectation she had formed about human nature. The medical bay was clean and bright, filled with the soft sounds of monitoring equipment and the gentle voices of nurses checking on patients. Her first coherent thought was confusion. She should be dead, buried in the mud of Cordis II, her body becoming part of the toxic soil that had claimed so many others. Instead, she was alive, her wounds dressed with professional care, her pain managed by medications that dulled the sharp edges of her injuries. A human nurse noticed her awakening and approached with cautious kindness, offering water and speaking in slow, careful words that Nira's universal translator could process. The woman's eyes held no hatred, no fear, only the professional compassion of someone dedicated to healing. It was a revelation that shattered every preconception Nira had held about the enemy she had been fighting. The first time she saw James, he was standing in the doorway of her room, his face showing the uncertainty of someone who had acted on instinct and was now confronting the full implications of his choice. He was older than she had expected, his hair graying at the temples, his eyes carrying the weight of too many battles and too many losses. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm, explaining in simple terms what had happened and why he had chosen to save her life. Nira listened in silence, her mind struggling to reconcile the reality of her situation with everything she had been taught about human cruelty and indifference. This man had risked everything to pull her from the mud, had defied his own military to preserve the life of an enemy soldier, and now faced court-martial for his act of compassion. As she looked into his eyes, Neera saw not the face of an enemy, but the expression of someone who understood that some principles transcended the boundaries of war, that mercy was not a weakness, but the highest expression of strength. The court-martial proceedings began 3 days after Neera had regained full consciousness, the military tribunal convening in a sterile conference room that felt more like a tomb than a place of justice. James sat at the defendant's table in his dress uniform, the medals on his chest a testament to 15 years of exemplary service that now seemed meaningless in the face of his single act of defiance. The charges were read with mechanical precision: violation of airspace restrictions, disobedience of direct orders, unauthorized contact with enemy personnel, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Each accusation fell like a hammer blow, the legal language transforming his moment of compassion into a catalogue of military crimes. The prosecution painted him as a rogue officer whose emotional instability had compromised operational security and set a dangerous precedent for future conflicts. They spoke of duty and discipline, of the necessity of maintaining clear boundaries between friend and foe, of the chaos that would ensue if every soldier began making individual moral judgments about the conduct of war. Colonel Harrison, the tribunal's presiding officer, was a career military man whose face had been carved by decades of difficult decisions and moral compromises. He had served in 3 previous conflicts, had seen the cost of war measured in both human and alien lives, and understood the delicate balance required to maintain military effectiveness while preserving some semblance of humanity. As he listened to the testimony, his expression remained carefully neutral, but those who knew him could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. The law was clear. James had violated multiple regulations and deserved punishment. But the spirit of those laws, the principles they were meant to protect, seemed somehow diminished by the rigid application of military justice to an act of pure compassion. The colonel found himself questioning not just the defendant's actions, but the entire framework of rules and regulations that had brought them to this moment. Dr. Chen took the stand as a character witness, her testimony carrying the weight of professional authority and moral conviction. She spoke about the Hippocratic Oath, about the obligation to preserve life regardless of political considerations, about the precedent set by military medical personnel who had treated enemy wounded throughout history. Her words painted James not as a rogue officer, but as someone who had acted in accordance with the highest principles of military medicine, someone who had recognized that the preservation of life was a duty that transcended the artificial boundaries of war. She described Neera's injuries in clinical detail, emphasizing that without immediate intervention, the alien woman would have died alone and forgotten in the mud of Cordus II. The prosecution objected repeatedly, arguing that medical ethics did not supersede military law, but Chen's testimony had already planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the tribunal members. The most dramatic moment came when Neera herself was called to testify, her appearance in the courtroom causing a stir among the assembled officers and observers. She walked slowly to the witness stand, her movements still careful due to her healing injuries, her alien features drawing stares from those who had never seen one of the enemy up close. When she spoke, her words were translated by the court's linguistic systems, but her meaning transcended language barriers. She described her final moments in the trench, the certainty of death, the abandonment by her own forces, and the impossible sight of a human ship descending through forbidden airspace to save her life. Her voice broke as she recounted waking up in the human medical facility, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate her, but who had instead chosen to heal her wounds and preserve her life. She looked directly at James as she spoke, her eyes filled with a gratitude that seemed to illuminate the entire courtroom. The defense attorney, a young captain named Rodriguez, who had volunteered for the case despite its potential impact on her own career, built her argument around the concept of moral courage and the precedent of individual conscience in military service. She cited historical examples of soldiers who had disobeyed orders to prevent atrocities, who had chosen humanity over military expediency, who had recognized that some principles were more important than regulations. She argued that James's actions represented not a breakdown of military discipline, but its highest expression, the willingness to risk everything for the preservation of life and the advancement of human dignity. The prosecution countered with arguments about the slippery slope of individual moral judgment, the necessity of absolute obedience in military operations, and the potential consequences of allowing personal conscience to override military law. The debate raged for hours, each side presenting compelling arguments that seemed to tear at the very fabric of military justice. As the proceedings drew to a close, the weight of the decision settled over the tribunal like a heavy shroud. They were being asked to judge not just the actions of one man, but the entire moral framework of military service in an age of interstellar conflict. The law demanded punishment, but justice seemed to require something more nuanced, more human. Colonel Harrison called for a recess, and the tribunal members withdrew to deliberate, carrying with them the burden of a decision that would echo far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Outside, James sat in silence, his fate hanging in the balance, while Naira waited in her hospital room, her own future uncertain, but her life preserved by the courage of a man who had chosen compassion over conformity. The moral axis of the war had indeed shifted, and now the military justice system would have to decide whether that shift represented progress or peril for the future of human civilization. The medical bay hummed with sterile efficiency, but beneath its clinical veneer lay the weight of impossible decisions. James stood before Admiral Chen's holographic projection, the blue light casting harsh shadows across his weathered features. The Admiral's expression remained carved from stone, her eyes reflecting decades of military precision that had never wavered, until now. Behind her, the war room buzzed with activity, officers moving like ghosts through corridors that had become temples to strategic necessity. The silence between them stretched like a chasm, filled with the unspoken understanding that this moment would define not just careers, but the very soul of their species. James felt the gravity of his choice settling into his bones, a burden that would follow him through whatever remained of his life. The rescue had been completed, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. Chen's voice cut through the silence with surgical precision, each word measured and deliberate. "Lieutenant Solin, your actions have created what our analysts are calling a moral precedent in active combat zones." Her fingers drummed against the metal surface of her desk, a rhythmic countdown to judgment that echoed through the transmission. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying implications that neither of them could fully comprehend. James understood that precedents in war were dangerous things. They created expectations, obligations, and most terrifyingly, hope where none had existed before. The Admiral's eyes searched his face for signs of regret, for the crack in his resolve that would allow her to classify this as temporary insanity rather than calculated rebellion. But James had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, and they both knew it. The weight of command had never felt heavier than it did in this moment of reckoning. In the medical bay, 3 decks below, Naira drifted between consciousness and dreams that tasted of mud and betrayal. Her body fought against the human medical technology that coursed through her veins, alien chemistry clashing with foreign healing protocols in ways that defied both species' understanding. Doctor Sarah Martinez worked with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery on the future itself, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. Every cell regenerated represented a small victory against the entropy of war, a declaration that life could triumph over the machinery of death. Nira's breathing had stabilized, but her mind remained trapped in the trenches, reliving the moment when her own kind had written her off as acceptable losses. The irony was not lost on her. She was being saved by the very species she had been trained to destroy. Each heartbeat was a betrayal of everything she had been taught to believe about human nature. The ship's corridors buzzed with whispered conversations that died the moment officers passed by. Word of the rescue had spread through the crew like wildfire, igniting debates that had no clear answers and raising questions that challenged the fundamental assumptions of their mission. Some viewed James as a hero who had finally remembered what they were fighting for. Others saw him as a traitor who had compromised operational security for the sake of misguided compassion. The division ran deeper than mere opinion. It struck at the heart of what it meant to be human in a universe that seemed determined to strip away their humanity piece by piece. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez found himself defending James to younger crew members who had never known war without hatred, while simultaneously questioning whether mercy was a luxury they could afford. The rescue had saved one life, but it had also fractured the moral certainty that had held them together through the darkest moments of the conflict. Admiral Chen's next words carried the weight of institutional authority, but beneath them lay a tremor of uncertainty that betrayed her own internal struggle. The Corps' High Command has issued a formal protest through neutral channels, claiming that your actions constitute a violation of established combat protocols. Her pause stretched long enough for James to understand that this was more than military bureaucracy. It was the first crack in a wall that had separated the species for generations. The protest itself was unprecedented. Enemy forces acknowledging a human action as something other than pure aggression represented a shift in the fundamental nature of their conflict. James realized that by saving Naira, he had inadvertently opened a door that neither side had been prepared to walk through. The Admiral's expression softened almost imperceptibly, revealing the woman beneath the uniform who understood that some choices transcended the boundaries of military law. The war had just become infinitely more complicated, and they were all struggling to navigate terrain that no manual had prepared them for. The weight of precedent settled over the ship like a shroud, transforming routine operations into exercises in moral philosophy that none of them were equipped to handle. James understood that his choice had created ripples that would spread far beyond this single vessel, touching every human ship, every alien outpost, every battlefield where the two species met in deadly embrace. The rescue had been an act of individual conscience, but its implications belonged to entire civilizations struggling to define themselves in the crucible of endless war. He thought of Naira lying unconscious in the medical bay, her life hanging in the balance between species that had forgotten how to see each other as anything more than targets. The irony was profound. In trying to save one enemy soldier, he might have saved them all from becoming the monsters their conflict was creating. But precedents were dangerous things, and James knew that the path he had chosen would demand sacrifices that he could not yet imagine. Consciousness returned to Nira like a tide washing over broken glass, each wave of awareness bringing fresh pain and disorienting clarity. The ceiling above her was wrong, too clean, too bright, lacking the familiar stains of mud and blood that had become her sky for months in the trenches. Her body felt alien to her, wrapped in bandages that smelled of human antiseptic and hope, substances that her people had been taught to associate with weakness and deception. The steady beep of monitoring equipment created a rhythm that her warrior's heart struggled to accept, each pulse a reminder that she was alive when she should have been dead, saved when she should have been abandoned. Memory crashed over her in fragments. The weight of earth, the taste of her own blood, the moment when her squad had left her behind like discarded ammunition. The betrayal burned worse than any physical wound, a violation of trust that cut deeper than enemy fire ever could. "Doctor," Martinez appeared at her bedside like a ghost materialized from enemy propaganda, her face bearing the kind of compassion that Naira had been trained to recognize as manipulation. But there was something in the human woman's eyes that defied every lesson about enemy psychology, a genuine concern that seemed to exist independent of strategic advantage or tactical gain. "You're safe," the doctor said in carefully pronounced Cordasi, the words carrying an accent that somehow made them more rather than less believable. Naira's throat felt like sandpaper as she tried to respond, her voice emerging as a croak that barely qualified as communication. The simple act of speaking required trust that she wasn't sure she possessed, an acknowledgement that she was dependent on the mercy of beings she had been raised to hate. Every breath was a small act of rebellion against everything she had been taught about human nature. The irony was not lost on her. She was more afraid of this kindness than she had ever been of human weapons. The medical bay around her hummed with technology that seemed almost magical compared to the crude field hospitals of her own forces. Machines monitored her vital signs with precision that spoke of a civilization that valued individual life over collective sacrifice, a concept that challenged the fundamental assumptions of her upbringing. Through the transparent walls, she could see human crew members going about their duties with an efficiency that lacked the desperate edge she had grown accustomed to in her own military. These people moved like they believed in tomorrow, like they had something worth preserving beyond the immediate demands of survival. The contrast was jarring. She had been taught that humans were barely controlled savages, driven by primitive emotions and incapable of the disciplined sacrifice that defined true civilization. But everything around her suggested a society that had somehow managed to maintain its humanity even in the depths of interstellar war. The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful, forcing her to question truths that had shaped her entire existence. James entered the medical bay with the careful movements of someone approaching a wild animal, his presence filling the space with an energy that Naira couldn't quite categorize. He was smaller than she had expected, lacking the brutal physicality that enemy propaganda had attributed to human soldiers. But there was something in his bearing that spoke of strength that went deeper than muscle and bone. His eyes held the weight of decisions that had cost him sleep, the burden of choices that had no clear right answers. "I'm the one who pulled you out," he said simply, the words carrying no expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement. Naira studied his face, searching for signs of the deception that her training insisted must be there, but finding only the exhaustion of someone who had stared into the abyss and chosen to act anyway. The silence between them stretched like a bridge over a chasm of mutual incomprehension, two beings from different worlds trying to find common ground in the wreckage of their conflict. She wanted to hate him. It would have been easier, cleaner, more in line with everything she had been taught about the nature of their war. But hatred required certainty, and certainty was the first casualty of James's inexplicable act of mercy. Naira found herself caught between the conditioning of a lifetime and the undeniable evidence of her own survival, forced to reconcile the propaganda of her youth with the reality of human compassion. "Why?" she managed to whisper, the word carrying the weight of every assumption that had just been shattered. James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing something beyond the walls of the medical bay. "Because leaving you there would have made me something I didn't want to become," he finally replied, the honesty in his voice cutting through her defenses like a blade through paper. The answer was simultaneously simple and profound, revealing a moral complexity that her people had insisted humans were incapable of possessing. Naira realized that she was not just recovering from physical wounds, she was being forced to rebuild her entire understanding of the universe and her place within it. The rescue had saved her life, but it had also destroyed the comfortable certainties that had made that life bearable. The weight of obligation settled over her like a shroud, heavier than any armor she had ever worn. In her culture, a life debt was a sacred thing, binding the saved to the savior in ways that transcended species, politics, and war. But this debt was complicated by the fact that her savior was supposed to be her enemy, a being she had been trained to kill without hesitation or remorse. The contradiction threatened to tear her apart, forcing her to choose between the loyalty of a lifetime and the gratitude of a moment that had redefined everything she thought she knew about the nature of good and evil. James seemed to understand her struggle without needing explanation, his presence both comforting and terrifying in its implications. The war would continue around them, but something fundamental had shifted in this small space where enemy and savior shared the same air. Naira closed her eyes and tried to imagine a future where such moments were possible, where mercy could exist alongside conflict, where the line between friend and foe was not drawn in blood, but in the choices that defined who they chose to become. News of the rescue spread through the human fleet like a virus, infecting every conversation with questions that had no easy answers and challenging assumptions that had seemed unshakable just days before. Captain Morrison of the destroyer Valiant found herself fielding calls from subordinates who wanted to know if the new precedent applied to their own operations, their voices carrying a mixture of hope and confusion that reflected the moral uncertainty now plaguing the entire command structure. The rescue had been a single act by a single pilot, but its implications rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that reached every corner of human space. In officers' lounges and enlisted quarters, debates raged about the nature of mercy in wartime, the value of enemy life, and the question of whether humanity could afford to maintain its moral high ground when survival itself was at stake. The comfortable certainties of us versus them had been shattered, replaced by a complex landscape of ethical considerations that no military academy had prepared them to navigate. The war had become infinitely more complicated, and everyone was struggling to find their footing on shifting moral ground. Admiral Chen stood before the assembled fleet commanders, her image transmitted across dozens of ships scattered throughout the quarter system. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier as she attempted to address questions that challenged the very foundations of their military doctrine. The actions of Lieutenant Solin represent an individual choice that does not constitute official policy, she began, but even as the words left her mouth, she could see the skepticism in the faces before her. Policy was one thing, precedent was another entirely, and they all understood that James's rescue had created expectations that would be impossible to ignore. The silence that followed her statement stretched uncomfortably long, filled with the unspoken understanding that the war had just entered uncharted territory. Commander Hayes of the cruiser Determination finally broke the silence with a question that cut to the heart of their dilemma. Admiral, if we encounter similar situations, are we authorized to exercise similar discretion? The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying implications that none of them were prepared to fully explore. Chen realized that she was being asked to define the soul of their species in the middle of a war that had already cost them so much. Across the void of space, the Cordasi High Command grappled with their own crisis of understanding. General Vextar stood before the War Council, his scarred features reflecting the confusion that had gripped their entire military hierarchy since news of the rescue had reached their lines. "A human ship violated our airspace to extract one of our wounded," he reported, the words sounding absurd even as he spoke them. The concept was so foreign to Cordasi military doctrine that several council members initially dismissed it as enemy propaganda designed to sow confusion in their ranks. But the evidence was undeniable. Sensor logs, communication intercepts, and most damning of all, the testimony of survivors who had witnessed the impossible sight of a human vessel landing in contested territory to save an enemy soldier. The rescue challenged everything they believed about human nature, forcing them to confront the possibility that their enemy possessed a capacity for mercy that their own culture had systematically eliminated. The implications were staggering. If humans could show compassion to their enemies, what did that say about a species that had abandoned such concepts in the name of military efficiency? The philosophical crisis rippled through both fleets like a plague of conscience, infecting every level of command with questions that had no clear answers. Young officers who had grown up hating an abstract enemy now found themselves wondering about the individuals behind the weapons, while veteran commanders struggled to reconcile decades of military doctrine with the evidence of enemy compassion. The rescue had created a crack in the wall of mutual dehumanization that both sides had built to make the killing bearable, and through that crack, uncomfortable truths were beginning to seep. Chaplain Williams aboard the Redemption found himself fielding more requests for spiritual guidance than he had received in the previous 6 months combined, as crew members grappled with questions about the nature of evil and the possibility of redemption. The war had always been about survival, but now it was also about the kind of species they wanted to be when the fighting finally ended. The rescue had forced them to confront the possibility that their enemy might not be the monsters they had been taught to believe, and that realization was more terrifying than any weapon. In the depths of space between the opposing fleets, automated monitoring stations recorded the strangest phenomenon in the history of interstellar warfare: a temporary cessation of hostilities that seemed to occur spontaneously across multiple sectors. It wasn't an official ceasefire, but rather a collective hesitation, as if both sides were suddenly uncertain about the righteousness of their cause. Patrol ships that would normally engage on site instead maintained cautious distances, their crews struggling with orders that suddenly seemed less clear-cut than they had just days before. The rescue had created a moment of moral vertigo that affected everyone who heard about it, forcing soldiers on both sides to question whether the being in their crosshairs might be someone worth saving rather than someone who deserved to die. The phenomenon lasted only hours before military discipline reasserted itself, but those hours represented something unprecedented in the history of their conflict. A moment when the machinery of war paused to consider the weight of individual conscience. The implications were staggering, suggesting that the rescue had accomplished something that years of diplomacy had failed to achieve. It had made both sides remember that their enemies were people. The weight of precedent settled over both fleets, like a shroud, transforming routine military operations into exercises in moral philosophy that no one was equipped to handle. James's choice had been personal, driven by individual conscience rather than strategic calculation, but its effects were reshaping the fundamental nature of their conflict in ways that neither side could control or predict. The rescue had opened a door that could never be fully closed, creating possibilities for mercy and compassion that would haunt every future engagement. In medical bays and command centers, in enlisted quarters and officers' lounges, the same questions echoed through both fleets. What did it mean to be human in a universe that seemed determined to strip away their humanity? Could mercy exist alongside military necessity? And most troubling of all, if their enemies were capable of such unexpected compassion, what did that say about the nature of the war they were fighting? The rescue had saved one life, but it had also infected an entire conflict with the dangerous possibility of hope, and no one knew what that might ultimately cost them all. The communication came through neutral channels at 0347 ship time, a formal request that sent shockwaves through the human command structure. General Vextar himself was requesting a direct conversation with Lieutenant James Solin, the first time in the war's history that a Cordasi commander had asked to speak with an individual human soldier. Admiral Chen stared at the message for a full minute, her mind racing through the implications of what appeared to be an unprecedented breach in military protocol. The request was couched in formal diplomatic language, but beneath the careful phrasing lay something that resembled curiosity rather than strategic necessity. The very fact that the enemy knew James's name and rank suggested a level of intelligence gathering that was both impressive and unsettling. Chen realized that she was being asked to authorize a conversation that could either represent a breakthrough in interspecies relations or a catastrophic security breach. The weight of the decision pressed down on her like the gravity of a dying star, forcing her to choose between military caution and the possibility of something unprecedented. James stood in the communication chamber, surrounded by recording equipment and security personnel who seemed as nervous as he felt. The holographic projector hummed to life, revealing the scarred features of General Vextar, whose reputation as a brilliant tactician was matched only by his ruthlessness in combat. The Cordasi general's eyes held an intelligence that transcended species barriers, a calculating awareness that seemed to pierce through the technological barrier separating them. "Lieutenant Solin," Vexitar began, his voice carrying an accent that made human words sound like ancient poetry, "your actions have created what my analysts describe as an anomaly in our conflict." The word hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, carrying implications that neither of them fully understood. James found himself studying the alien's features, searching for signs of deception or manipulation, but finding only the same exhaustion that he saw in his own mirror each morning. The war had aged them both in ways that transcended physical appearance, carving lines of moral complexity into faces that had once held simple certainties. The conversation that followed defied every assumption about enemy psychology that either side had developed over years of bitter conflict. Vextar spoke with the measured cadence of someone choosing each word carefully, his questions revealing a mind grappling with concepts that challenged the fundamental assumptions of his military training. "In our culture," he explained, "the wounded who cannot fight are considered expendable. Your rescue of Corporal Then suggests a different philosophy." The admission was startling in its honesty, revealing a vulnerability that James had never expected to see in an enemy commander. The general's eyes held something that might have been regret, a shadow of doubt about choices made in the name of military efficiency. James realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented, an enemy leader questioning the moral foundations of his own civilization. The weight of that realization settled over him like a shroud, forcing him to confront the possibility that the war had damaged both sides in ways that went far deeper than casualties and destroyed ships. As the conversation continued, both men found themselves venturing into territory that no military manual had prepared them to navigate. They spoke of duty and conscience, of the weight of command, and the burden of choices that had no clear right answers. Vextar revealed that Naira's abandonment had been his decision, a calculation based on tactical necessity that now haunted his sleep with questions about the cost of survival. "She was one soldier among thousands," he said, his voice carrying a weariness that transcended species barriers, "but your actions suggest that individual lives have value beyond their tactical utility." The statement was both question and confession, revealing a mind struggling to reconcile military doctrine with moral complexity. James found himself responding with an honesty that surprised him, speaking about the moment when he had chosen to land despite orders, driven by something deeper than military training. The conversation was transforming from interrogation to dialogue, two warriors from different worlds, finding common ground in their shared struggle with the moral weight of command. The implications of their exchange rippled outward through both command structures like seismic waves, challenging assumptions that had seemed unshakable just hours before. Admiral Chen listened to the recording with growing amazement. realizing that she was witnessing the first genuine communication between their species since the war began. The conversation had revealed that their enemies were not the mindless savages of propaganda, but complex beings grappling with the same moral questions that plagued human commanders. The revelation was both hopeful and terrifying, suggesting possibilities for understanding that could either end the war or make it infinitely more complicated. On the Cordasi side, Vextar's subordinates struggled to process their general's apparent fascination with enemy psychology, some viewing it as strategic brilliance, while others whispered about the corrupting influence of human contact. The conversation had opened a door between two civilizations that had forgotten how to see each other as anything more than targets, and no one knew what might emerge from that opening. The weight of precedent settled over both fleets like a storm front, heavy with the promise of change that neither side was prepared to handle. James's rescue had been an individual act of conscience, but the conversation it had spawned represented something far more significant, the first crack in the wall of mutual dehumanization that had made their war possible. Both men understood that they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, that their exchange had created possibilities for mercy and understanding that would haunt every future engagement. The war would continue, but it would never again be the simple matter of us versus them that it had been before. In the silence that followed their conversation, both James and Vextar were left to contemplate the weight of what they had unleashed. A dangerous possibility that their enemies might be worth saving rather than destroying, and the terrifying implications that realization held for the future of their conflict. 3 weeks after the rescue, Naira stood at the observation deck of the human medical ship, her reflection ghost-like against the stars that had witnessed so much death and destruction. Her body had healed with remarkable efficiency thanks to human medical technology, but the wounds to her understanding of the universe remained raw and bleeding. The view before her showed the contested space where both fleets maintained their uneasy standoff, weapons trained on each other across a void that seemed smaller now than it had before her rescue. She had been offered repatriation through neutral channels, a return to her own people that would restore the natural order of things and allow both sides to pretend that nothing fundamental had changed. But the choice was not as simple as it appeared. Returning meant accepting that her rescue had been an anomaly, a moment of weakness that could be dismissed and forgotten. The weight of that decision pressed down on her like the gravity of a dying world, forcing her to choose between the comfort of familiar hatred and the terrifying possibility of something unprecedented. Dr. Martinez found her there as the ship's night cycle began, the artificial lighting dimming to simulate the passage of time that had lost all meaning in the depths of space. "The transport will be here tomorrow," she said gently, her voice carrying the same compassion that had marked every interaction since Naira's awakening. The human woman had become something unprecedented in Naira's experience, an enemy who had shown her nothing but kindness, challenging every assumption about human nature that her culture had instilled. The irony was profound. She had learned more about mercy from her captors than she had ever experienced from her own people. Dr. Martinez's presence was both comforting and disturbing, a reminder that the universe was far more complex than the simple narratives of war and conquest that had shaped her entire existence. The doctor's eyes held a sadness that seemed to encompass not just Naira's situation, but the broader tragedy of two species locked in a conflict that neither fully understood. The weight of that understanding settled between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. James appeared in the doorway, his presence filling the observation deck with an energy that Naira had come to associate with difficult choices and moral complexity. Over the past weeks, their conversations had evolved from wary interrogation to something resembling friendship, a connection that transcended the boundaries of species and allegiance. He had shared stories of his home world, of family members lost to the war, of the moment when he had realized that survival without conscience was just another form of death. In return, Naira had spoken of her own losses, of comrades abandoned and dreams deferred, of the slow erosion of hope that had marked her military career. Their exchanges had revealed the fundamental similarity beneath their surface differences, two beings struggling to maintain their humanity in a conflict that seemed designed to strip it away. The friendship that had developed between them was dangerous in its implications, suggesting possibilities for understanding that could either heal their civilizations or destroy them both. The weight of that potential pressed down on them like the atmosphere of a hostile world. The conversation that followed would be remembered by historians as the moment when the war began to transform from a conflict between species into a struggle for the soul of galactic civilization. Naira spoke with the careful precision of someone choosing words that would echo through history, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that would affect billions of lives. "If I return," she said, staring out at the stars that had witnessed so much suffering, "I become proof that your mercy was meaningless, a moment of weakness that changed nothing." The statement hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, carrying implications that none of them were prepared to fully explore. James understood that she was offering him something unprecedented, the chance to prove that his rescue had been more than just individual conscience, that it could become the foundation for something larger and more significant. The choice was not just hers to make, it belonged to all of them, a collective decision about the kind of future they wanted to create from the ashes of their conflict. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, forcing them to confront possibilities that no military training had prepared them to handle. Dr. Martinez broke the silence with words that would later be carved into monuments commemorating the end of the old war and the beginning of something unprecedented. "What if there was another option?" she asked, her voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who had spent her career healing rather than destroying. The question opened a door that none of them had dared to imagine, suggesting possibilities that transcended the simple binary of enemy and ally. Naira turned from the window, her eyes reflecting the starlight, and something that might have been hope, a dangerous emotion in a universe that had taught her to expect nothing but betrayal and abandonment. The three of them stood in the observation deck like conspirators, planning a revolution, their shared understanding creating a moment of possibility that could either save their civilizations or damn them all. The weight of precedent settled over them like a blessing and a curse, transforming their individual choices into the foundation for a future that neither species had dared to imagine. The rescue had saved one life, but the choice they were contemplating could save them all from becoming the monsters their war was creating. The decision they reached that night would ripple through both fleets like a seismic wave, challenging every assumption about the nature of their conflict and the possibility of redemption in a universe that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. Naira's choice to remain, to become living proof that enemies could become allies, would force both sides to confront the fundamental question of what they were fighting for and whether survival was worth the cost of their souls. The war would continue, but it would never again be the simple matter of us versus them that it had been before. In the observation deck of a human medical ship, three beings from different worlds had chosen to believe in the possibility of something better, and that choice would echo through the stars until the last weapon fell silent, and the first words of peace were spoken across the void that had once seemed impossible to bridge.